So this is week 10, and we're looking at landscapes designed for public housing. So in this series, we've heard about Alexandra Road, Brunel Estate, and last week, Golden Lane Estate. And the first one last week of these registered landscapes not designed by a landscape architect. So our objective with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas and thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, to see what we can learn from this and take forward, to find out where the relevant archives are and what makes these places still so very special. So we've had a range of fascinating speakers who've accepted our invitations to focus in detail on each one of these post-war designed landscapes and gardens, which were added to Historic England's list last year. And for a number of subjects, we're lucky enough to have two speakers offering different viewpoints, as we have this evening. So this evening, we're delighted to welcome Dominic Cole. He's a landscape architect, president of the Gardens Trust. He was a designer of the Eden Project and now specialises in historic parks and gardens, for which he's won many prestigious awards. He played a vital role in the restoration of Jellicoe's water gardens at Hemel Hempstead. His recent investigations include the historical development of the gardens at the Temple and the original gardens for the landscape of Churchill Gardens at Pimlico. So over to you, Dominic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you to all the team. It's great to be invited to participate in this really good series. My apologies if I don't actually look straight at you, but I'm going to read my notes while I go through the presentation, which is not a lecture, it's a talk. So first slide, please. So Churchill Gardens is in Pimlico in London. It's opposite Battersea Power Station. It was added to the English Heritage Register of Parks and Gardens as one of the mid-20th century sites of interest following a campaign started by the Gardens Trusts, who were concerned that some of these mid-20th century sites are being altered and lost. Some of the buildings at Churchill Gardens are listed in their own right, but what really distinguishes the 30-acre site is the significant extent of open space and landscape setting. Next slide. So Churchill Gardens, which is the site on the left behind the trees, was originally called the Pimlico Housing Scheme. Next. The scheme was built following Westminster City Council announcing a competition to design a new housing scheme in 1946 on an area that had become very run down. The competition was overseen by Westminster City Council Town Clerk, Mr. Parker Morris. Parker Morris later established the Parker Morris Committee, which prepared a report recommending space standards for public housing called Homes for Today or Tomorrow. Sorry, Homes for Today and Tomorrow, which led to adoption of a national policy for space provision in public housing. The revolutionary thinking by Westminster Council was immediately influential, being adopted by London County Council in 1951 and spreading across the country and further abroad. Architects, councils and students flocked to see the scheme. Next slide, please. The competition was won by two young architects, Philip Powell and Hidalgo Moya, known as Jacko, who had been in private practice for just 2 years after graduating from the Architectural Association. Their scheme was in the modernist style of simple, practical buildings that would be economic and pleasant to live in. Philip Powell, who before joining the Architectural Association had trained at Cambridge as an architect at Cambridge and had visited the continent to see the latest in new architecture. and he was particularly impressed by a social housing scheme in Rotterdam, the Kiefhoek estate. We'll have a quick look at that later, which was designed by J.J.P. Oud between 1925 and 1930, when he was the city architect for Rotterdam. And Oud is considered one of the four great modernists alongside Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier. He was also a member of Der Stil. Next slide. A key element of the design was the district heating system, which took excess heat from Battersea Power Station on the bottom of the slide, which was received in the accumulator tower, which is a little black blob in the middle of the estate there, for distribution of the heat across the estate. The heat was actually stored in distinctive oval tanks on the flat's rooftops. Next slide, please. So here we have a diagram of the Pimlico district housing scheme, Battersea Power Station on the left, and you can see the pipes going under the river to the heat accumulator. Next slide, please. And there we have the estate in its early days. We're looking from Battersea Power Station, the Coal Wharf, across to the accumulator tower. And there on top of the flats, you can see the distinctive oval tanks, which stored the heated water, which was then further distributed for both heating and hot water. Next slide. That's a view today. The Coal Wharf still exists. It's been repurposed as a promenade and seating area. You can go get a coffee, look across to the lovely accumulator tower and the flats. Next slide, please. So I visited the RIBA drawings collection, and thank you very much to them for agreeing to have some of the original drawings from Powell and Moya photographed. So this is one of the early drawings. These were the competition drawings, and obviously then the estate took another 15 plus years to build. So the drawings are quite simple, but I thought this was quite a helpful way of understanding. You've got these slab blocks. At the time in London, you couldn't build over 9 stories, and none of the blocks at Churchill Gardens are over 9 stories. And on the bottom there, you can see the flats compared to the accumulator tower on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. So the design of the blocks are arranged at right angles to the river, with generous amounts of open space between each block, which drew on similar arrangements that Philip Powell had seen in Germany, where the Bauhaus School of Architecture advocated parallel rows of buildings known as Zeilenbau, which ensured maximum sunlight and air would reach the housing in an attempt to alleviate tuberculosis, which in Germany at the time and elsewhere was a problem for poorer people. What you're actually looking at there is the parallel blocks at pretty much 45 degrees to the river. The lighter grey blocks on the river edge are actually only 2 stories, so there is no obstruction from the views out and air flowing through the estate. Next slide, please. And this is probably about 10, 15 years after building the estate, an aerial view, so that you can see the blocks actually having full access to both open space and views of the river. You can see the accumulator block at the nearly at the top there, and the estate is still actually in construction at this time. You can see on the left hand side there's a construction site in progress. Next slide, please. So this is the 1870 Ordnance Survey, showing the site before it was, obviously before it was developed. At the bottom, you can see the railway, which just to the bottom left goes into Victoria Station. And previous to the Churchill Gardens site being developed as a new housing estate, the whole area had become very run down, quite cramped housing, and right in the middle, you've got two wharves coming off the river and a whole series of commercial factories, which included a distillery, a lead works, and a sawmills. And previous to that, which I don't have a slide of, it was part of Ranelagh Tea Gardens, and you will know Ranelagh Gardens right to the very bottom of the drawing, which is now the site of the Chelsea Flower Show. So next slide, please. So within the estate, the whole idea being simplicity and economy, Powell and Moya actually retained the different levels of the two wharves. And this particular area is one of the wharves, which was actually used to provide play space and sports pitches. This is how it actually looks today. It's slightly changed, but it still retains its original use for pitches and play. And you can see here also some of the quite simple materials, concrete, brick, and paving patterns. Next one. And this is actually in a later part of the scheme, probably about 15 years later. But you can still see the use of different levels in the outdoor spaces, creating nice places for the residents to be outside and sit, to feel quite protected and sort of enclosed in these outdoor spaces. And again, the very simple use of materials, the simple brickwork, concrete copings, and very simple ironwork. Next slide, please. So this is actually the Kiefhoek estate in Rotterdam, which is showing the simple lines. This is about 10 years before Churchill Gardens. It's just pre-Second World War. The site that was designed by J.P. Oud, using very simple, again, very simple materials, quite strong colours, plenty of space between the buildings, which was a huge influence on Powell's thinking when he came to design Churchill Gardens. Next one, please. And here we have one of the entrances to one of the blocks of flats, where you can see this very simple use of big slab blocks of colour, which sort of say this is the entrance, but it's just really pared down piece of modernism to draw you to the entrance. And I'll also just point out that on the floor level there, you have the original 2x3 concrete paving blocks. What was available at the time, simple, cheap, but actually works with the scale of the buildings. Next one. I can't talk in any authoritative way about the architecture, but I just show you a couple of pictures. This is one of the earlier blocks. You can see that each flat has, plenty of light, outdoor balconies, plenty of fresh air, and you can just see right at the top the oval blocks, which were originally part of the district heating system. Next slide. And on the same block, these are the stairwells, which you can see is pretty much, part of the architectural statement. It's still there, and it is part of Churchill Gardens. Next one. And then one of the slightly later blocks, this is actually on Looper Street, the main shopping street, with a shopping parade below, which kind of protects the whole estate from Looper Street, which is on the north side of the estate, away from the river. Next one. So Powell and Moya designed all the open spaces themselves and did not work with a landscape architect. This is the central square, conceived as a market square, and it's to the right-hand side of the blocks that we just saw on Looper Street. And the idea was this open space, open square could be used as a market or for events for the residents and so on and so forth. From my research, it appears that the actual planting and choice of plants was made by Westminster City Council, or perhaps somebody they worked with, probably a landscape contractor, because Powell and Moya didn't actually name any trees or any plants. Next one. So that's the market square today. It's a really pleasant space, good scale with the buildings, and apparently I have not actually seen it while there's an event ongoing, but it is very much used. Again, I'll draw your attention to the simple materials. On the right-hand side, the stone paving slabs, which I'm guessing were one of the repurposed materials from the original site, from street paving, the wharves, etc. Concrete retaining walls on the right. But on the left-hand side, you can see the herringbone block paving, which is actually a replacement paving, which actually doesn't really work with the scale of the buildings. We'll see more of that later. It's a little bit too busy. And this would originally have been the concrete 2x3 slabs. Next slide, please. And we can see that in detail with the original stone paved steps and the herringbone block brick. You could say it's pretty in that detail, but when you actually see this on site relating to the scale of the buildings and the scale of the space, the concrete block pavers are all a bit too itsy bitsy and a bit hectic. Next one, please. That's just another of Powell and Moya's original drawings, just showing the idea of green space, the concept that there would be trees in the green space, trees and shrubs. But again, as I say, Powell and Moya didn't actually name any of the plants. It was just that was how they conceived the spaces to be. Next slide. And that's just a quick peek today. The landscape has grown beautifully, big mature trees. There's plenty of space for them to actually grow properly between the buildings, and they are very much used and very much loved by the residents. Next slide. I wanted to just show you this for a couple of reasons. One is this is a bin store, but it's a really lovely architectural piece. That blue brick is actually a snail shape, so you walk inside and the bins are inside. And then you've got this wonderful, very simple concrete roof on spindly metal uprights. And instead of it being sort of hidden away, it's there, you know it's a bin store, but actually it doesn't have to be ugly, it's a rather pretty thing. And once again, I refer to the reuse, repurposing of materials. You've got the stone cobbles, which again, I'm assuming have been reused from the wharves and the streets, and those two fantastic granite bollards, which occur all over the estate. And again, I am guessing, I can't tell you exact sourcing for that, for my reasoning, but I'm guessing that these were bollards that were used along the wharves. Next slide, please. So that's just giving you an idea of the replacement of the original 2 foot by 3 foot concrete slabs that were all over the estate with these rather tiny concrete blocks, which also vary in color. And you can see that the scale of those little teeny tiny bricks is slightly, it sort of distracts it, you know, your eye is drawn to this little pattern, this herringbone pattern, whereas previously it was very much simpler, just to go with the concept of simplicity and flow through the estate. Next slide. So Powell and Moya did have great fun, I think, it looks like it from their drawings, creating playgrounds and the sports pitches in between the estates. So you can see here one of the early ideas. It's quite a busy playground. You've got a boat mooring, you've got hopscotch, you've got climbing bits and pieces, swings, and so on and so forth. So it was rather fun to actually see this, because the actual detail, the playgrounds no longer exist. There are modern play areas with nice bright red swings and so on, but this unfortunately didn't survive. Next. And here is another part of one of the playgrounds, the castle. And again, you can see the reuse of the stone cobbles in creating the mound on which the castle is stood. Next slide. I had to chuck that one in because this is Philip Powell standing on his creation, overseeing all that he made, which I think is a rather nice view. Next one. We're just hopping across and down the river to the Festival of Britain site. The actual site layout obviously is not by by Powell and Moya, but it gives you a sense of the 1950s, the sort of modernist creations. And what I wanted to draw your attention to here is the very simple concrete slab roof shelter in the middle, which just reminded me of the work that Powell and Moya were doing on the estate. But Powell and Moya did create things at the Festival of Britain. Sorry, and I've just noticed while that slide has come up nice and big, on the left-hand side, you can see some flower pots, and those are and I've completely forgotten her first name, Shepherd flower pots designed in concrete for the Festival of Britain site, and you can still see them around London today. Next slide, please. So this is the South Bank, excuse me, and the Skylon, designed in 1951 by Powell and Moya, hence the title of the talk and my reference to Dan Dare. I'm guessing that Powell and Moya were just, again, having fun, and this is a reference to modernism, the space age, etc., and they were just playing with the whole idea. And the Skylon was an iconic piece. Next slide. Which must have just been, an extraordinary thing to witness, rather more elegant than the London Eye, if I may say so. And again, those rather fine pots in the foreground. Next slide, please. I particularly like this one, again, referring to Dan Dare and boys comics. This is the flying saucer, part of one of the elements in one of the playgrounds. Don't mention health and safety. Next slide. And there it is, being climbed on with those wonderful concrete climbing blocks. Kind of, again, nice sharp edges, beautiful bits of health and safety there. And I think the next one is my last slide. And there you have it. So I leave you with Powell and Moya's Flying Saucer, fantastic fun for children, and sadly no longer with us. So I think that was the last slide.
Annabelle, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just got completely carried away. Thank you very much, Dominic. We will come back and speak more later on. I'd like to introduce Jennifer now, please, for something a little different. Jennifer White is the National Landscape Advisor at Historic England, with England-wide responsibility for historic parks and gardens, their conservation planning policy, advice, research and standards. So over to you.
Good evening. I will switch on my camera in a moment. So this has been a great series. Wonderful having insights to all these post-war landscape designs, and we've seen a huge range, and there's more to come. So Dominic and I thought it would be timely at this point at week 10 to prompt you to begin to think about the conservation challenges and perhaps open up discussion this evening, but also the forthcoming evenings too. So by explanation about who I am, I do have this grand title, National Landscape Advisor, but I'm one of the 6 landscape architects in working at Historic England, and my 5 colleagues are based in our regional teams around the country, and they provide specialist support on casework and grants related to change and managing change. And I'm based in our National Specialist Services Department and lead on design, landscape policy, guidance and research. So obviously one of the important conservation tools that we have is designation, and in particular registration and listing, but there are also local tools such as conservation areas and local lists. The purpose of the National Register, which was set up 38 years ago, was to identify parks and gardens of a high level of historic interest in the context of England's cultural heritage, by thereby encouraging owners and others to appreciate, maintain, repair and enhance such sites. So I thought it'd be quite useful just to have a brief recap about the register, so you can think about the role of designation and also its strengths and weaknesses, what it can do, what it can't do. So it was established by statute in 1983, and the first entries date from 1984. And the registrations now form part of the online National Heritage List, which was set up in 2011 to bring together all the national designations, design landscapes, scheduled monuments, listings, battlefields, and wrecks. And I think the first point to make is the register is often incorrectly expressed as a non-statutory designation. The register is set up by statute. What people actually really mean is that there are no statutory defined controls or consent procedures, and that the only influence the register has is through the planning system, where it's been a material consideration in the assessment of planning applications since the mid-1990s. The register was always intended to compass much more than just parks and gardens. So again, you know, the title is a little bit misleading. It captures all landscapes consciously laid out for ornamental effect or recreational purposes, and it's firmly linked to the history of gardening and landscaping. As a collection of the most important or representative examples of styles and designers, the register tells the story of garden history. There are published selection criteria for date and rarity, with a test on survival and intactness becoming more exacting as we move forward in time. Other criteria include the role of sites, designs in influencing ideas about taste, sites as representative examples of nationally important designers' work, sites associated with important people or events, And lastly, also, we look at the group value of heritage assets as a whole. The time span of the register is continually rolled forward. Generally, sites over 30 years can be considered. And the idea behind this 30-year rule is to help the examination of significance of a site over at least one generation. And the youngest design that we're interested in terms of this theme of lectures is Arnold Weddell's Pearl Centre landscape at Peterborough, which was executed in 1989 to 1992. Yeah, no problems here. So I thought also it'd be useful just to sort of think about the types of sites and how we sort of think about it in terms of the register. So there are 3 broad categories representing the register: those associated with domestic use, those that belong to institution type places, and then lastly sites that are designed as sort of a public amenity. As of this month, there are currently 1,699 sites. So we're at a very interesting point. I wonder what 1,700 is going to be. And I estimate, this is very approximate, but I think there are about 4% of that 1,699 are actually post-1945 landscape designs, and that includes the 24 that were added to the register last summer. Examples of other sites had already been included in the register, and if you're interested, you can actually see a list that was produced in 2013, which is still available via the Gardens Trust website. And indeed, as well as the sites that are clearly 20th century design, that there are many more that include post-war layers of design. So I thought it might be useful just to sort of talk a little bit about the process of getting sort of sites registered and what happens. So last year's new registrations are an example of a thematic review. And the advantage of doing these reviews is that we can study, assess and calibrate a group of sites together. And certainly the 24 that were added last year will help set comparators for any new additions to the register. We do also consider spot listings or registrations, but the priority is always to give to sites facing change or they're under threat. So registration assessment has to be triggered by an application, and that application is an online process. Then my listing colleagues carry out an initial assessment to determine whether or not a site may merit further investigation. And well-documented and reasoned applications can really help get a site through this initial sift. The listing colleagues then carry out a full assessment, which includes a site visit, more research, and consultation, which is when I and the other landscape architects get involved in the process. All that information and representations are then considered, and a recommendation is made whether or not the site should be added to the National Heritage List. All the register entries follow the same structure, and the focus of the entry is about defining the special historic interests, the reasons for designation, the principal features, and of course there's a map showing the boundary of the registered area. Within the description of each division, reference is made to the key phases of development as reflected in the landscape at the time of writing. and an indication of the state of repair of each division and of the main features is provided where this is particularly poor or where a main feature has undergone major change. So the description covers the siting of a division in the wider landscape of the site, landform and earthworks, evidence of earlier landscapes, water features, constructions, buildings and other sort of architectural features, plants and plantings, and views. The line on the registered maps is intended to show the extent of the historic design landscape that survives in sufficiently good condition to justify its inclusion within the registered area. And that may be something that we want to discuss, is actually, you know, how we deal with extensive landscapes. And Dominic's already illustrated at Churchill Gardens the importance of the relationship with the river and the views in and out. The National Heritage List now has an added facility which is called Enrich the List, which allows all of us to share photographs, archives, research, and other information as a way of augmenting the official entry. So it's a great way of actually connecting information together, and something that actually I think we could all be using more to just help people actually understand the significance of these sites. As well as registration, listing is also a useful tool for the structural elements of design landscapes. And I think this may be in particular very relevant to post-1945 landscapes. And when we assess sites for designation, one of the considerations is thinking about what is the best designation regime, or what we need to do. We need to have a combination of registrations and listings. One of the advantages about listing is that it does confer statutory controls. So in some cases that actually provides better protection than registration. And for those sites that are on the cusp of the period that we're sort of talking about, the very early ones, they actually might be covered by the sort of curtilage rules for listing. I thought I'd just sort of briefly mention the fact that, you know, we are actually continuously working to improve the National Heritage List, and there's work underway now for a new listing strategy. And Matthew Saunders was commissioned to provide a review to inform this strategy. And you can find his recommendations online, and there are a couple that relate to gardens. He's raised the question whether we should re-examine whether there should be statutory controls for design landscapes, and also this relationship between registration and listing and how it actually sort of works. Conservation areas are also potentially a very important tool. They can include these landscapes, and often they too provide a very effective regime because they can set up policies to conserve all aspects of the character of the appearance of the area that's defined as special interest. And all the features listed or otherwise within the area are recognised as part of that character, including trees and materials such as paving. And in the forefront at the moment is a lot of interest on local heritage lists. Approximately half of local planning authorities hold such lists, and although they vary in scope and whether or not they are formally adopted as a local plan, they do help raise awareness about significance of local features. And the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities has recognised the value of these local lists, and they're currently running 22 pilots to look at how to create new lists and indeed improve the existing ones. So on to the last slide. We obviously need to sort of take stock about the changes and consequences for these landscapes. What was new and exciting design is now beginning to age, or arguably only just reaching maturity as landscapes. Just beginning to mature. We see right across the board that maintenance and upkeep varies enormously across landscape types and indeed over time. And sadly, often long-term neglect and poor condition is often used to justify redevelopment of these sites. As Dominic has illustrated, over time we see a creep as infrastructure needs to be replaced or upgraded, and sites adapted to meet new needs. Materials and specifications are gradually changed, and all these incremental changes unintentionally undermine the original design, its style, its character, and what Dominic said, erodes that sort of sense of spirit of that age of design. Such changes are often permitted development and do not require planning consent. The Historic England and the statutory amenity societies only have to be consulted if there is a planning application, and most post-1945 design landscapes are registered Grade 2, so my colleagues at Historic England won't even be involved. We get involved at a higher level of grading. Often these buildings and landscapes are very much integrated designs, and changes to either the landscape or the buildings impacts the other part of the sites. Registration is catching up with listing to ensure that the landscapes are recognised as well as the structures. And last week we looked at the Golden Lane estate, which has now been registered, but actually the buildings at Golden Lane have been listed for more than 20 years. I think there are probably more to address, and it may be actually that if we were smart, we could be using tools like Enrich the List just to make that link, and actually to make sure that landscape designs of note are linked with their sort of listed buildings. As I sort of explained, intactness and integrity are key tests in the case for designation, and condition does colour assessment, and particularly grading. Occasionally, Historic England has to step in to de-designate heritage assets where change has led to historic interest being lost. Although very few registered sites have been de-designated, 2 of them are actually post-1945 cases. And the first one was the Grade 2 star Harlow Water Gardens, designed by Frederick Gibbard, which was deregistered in 2003 after the gardens site and the 1958 town hall were redeveloped. The new scheme relocated and carefully reconstructed the gardens, but it rather missed the point that the special historic interest was lost. And I think this is very much a personal view, not a Historic England one, but I think I can see the setting of the water gardens had been eroded over time. And in that sense, the register was actually weak in actually not making that link and actually understanding or being able to describe the gardens in their context. And it was very much a scheme that had a contrast in formality at the water gardens with links out to the open Essex countryside. And the other designation case was the Commonwealth Institute Grade 2 landscape. The building was listed at Grade 2 star. It became a hot development case, and a register entry review was carried out in 2009. It did actually reconfirm the significance of the site and the landscape as and the landscape and building as post-war examples. However, there was a little chink opened up because there was a question about the role of Sylvia Crowe, and it really opened up the way for the developer to make a case for enabling development scheme to conserve the institute, which is Grade 2 star, by redeveloping the Grade 2 landscape. And it was a sad day when I had to make a case to actually take that site off the register. So I think you're probably all with me, but developing a better understanding of individual designs through research is really key to ensuring their future. We call it informed conservation, and certainly the work of Fowler and the University of Reading in helping to safeguard archives is applauded. We need these archives to help understand the significance of the designs and their sensitive restoration and care. And designation is a useful tool, but it's only a starting point, and it isn't necessarily an all-encompassing safeguard.
Fantastic.
Jennifer.
Sorry, Helen.
Thank you. Jennifer and Dominic, thank you so much. Dominic, for such a wonderful tour around Churchill Gardens, and Jennifer for that amazing peek into the principles and, dare I say it, challenges and bureaucracy of the registration system. I wonder, before we started, you did, well, Jennifer volunteered, you and Dominic, perhaps to have a short conversation. And thank you for ending reasonably promptly so that we have a little more time than usual to perhaps develop a dialogue. I wonder if I gave you 5 minutes maximum, and I will be very strict on that unless everybody's left by then, to have a little bit of a conversation from the, you know, the current designer, restoration, and the well, the gamekeeper and the policeman, if you like, or the just to illustrate. Particularly, I thought, Jennifer, you mentioned the strengths and weaknesses of the system, but I was also interested in the challenges, and then you mentioned chinks, and I think all that is perhaps germane to this conversation. I'm in your hands. Over to you two.
Could I jump in?
Yes.
And just pick up on something that Jennifer said, which is absolutely true, which is the register reflects the site at the time of writing. And that was particularly important in the case of the Commonwealth Institute, where there was a planning process to change the site pretty much at the same time or soon after the site was being considered for registration as an important landscape. And the planning process does not consider all the beautiful things that we think about, the beauty of space, the beauty of landscape. The planning process actually deals with box ticking and stuff online. So the people who are actually considering an application won't necessarily look at the site, and usually, often, generally, mostly, the people who are actually considering the site will not be experts or interested in what we consider to be important historic landscapes. Further, in the planning process, in the box ticking process, which is done by a 5-year-old at their desk in an office somewhere, if you are an important statutorily protected species, you get a much higher score than if you're a grade 1 registered landscape. So that in the which is severe effect or minimum effect, generally, if you're a grade 1 registered landscape, you can only ever get up to about minimum effect if you've got a motorway ploughing through your grade 1 registered site. Point made.
Can I comment to that? I mean, I understand Dominic's point. I think I'd be much more pragmatic, and I think what Dominic is illustrating is just how important it is to be able to explain to others the significance of these sites and why change impacts on them and how. And you can't leave it to others to interpret. You know, we need to sort of bring the expertise to fore. So you've got to help the planners and the decision makers do their job. So that, you know, that research is very, very important. And there was another point I was going to make. We've gone that way.
While you're thinking, Jennifer, is it this an appropriate moment to ask Annabelle to unmute and perhaps ruminate on the comments that you've made, particularly the last one?
Right, yeah, no, happy to. So the developer
will come back to you.
Contacted the Landscape Institute at the time of the Commonwealth Institute and asked to see any of Sylvia Crow's papers and drawings related to the to that project, and there weren't any. And they said, but there were lots of other drawings of hers there, and they said, well, you know, if it wasn't important for her to keep these drawings, then it, you know, it can't have been an important project to her, which is a shocking argument. I don't know the reason why she didn't include those drawings or what happened to them, but you know, it was I was flabbergasted by that. and tried very hard to defend her, you know, the what she had done.
And I think, you know, Dominic's work at Churchill Gardens shows you actually how much information you can find. So, you know, the register, you know, does some research, but it's not ever intended to be the definitive history of a site. And that's the point, is there is more to discover. And the other point that I was going to make, which I think was very beautifully illustrated with the Alexandra Road Park scheme, is just how well managed and delivered restoration projects can actually reveal the significance of design. And, you know, it's really to sort of counter the argument, you know, there's too much of a sort of assumption that where condition has declined, that, you know, the only way forward is to redevelop. Actually, the beauty with historic landscape designs is that you can actually restore them, but it requires a lot of thought and sensitivity to actually bring them alive again, to actually recapture that spirit of the age that Dominic was talking about.
May I just ask, is it always appropriate to recreate the spirit of that age when society and usage has changed?
Yeah, but I think, you know, Alexandra Road Park, Neil very eloquently showed us about how to marry that together, that actually play equipment that was thought appropriate when Janet Jack did the design has been outmoded by health and safety requirements. But Neil and Joe found other solutions, and it works. So it's actually understanding the capacity within these sort of landscape designs for change and adaptation, and how to keep them relevant, and to help them move on, help them ensure they've got a future. And I would argue very much at the moment, with climate change at the forefront, we should be realising that past investment rather than losing it.
Can I ask Karen? I think there's
So much of it gets lost through. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on, Annabelle. I'm sure Karen can hold her horses for a moment.
No, please.
Well, Karen's. I think you have 3 questions or comments. Karen, are you there? And are you willing to unmute and? Yeah, here she comes.
Hi, Helen. I won't turn my camera on because I haven't brushed my hair. Listen, Jennifer and Dominic, thank you. That was wonderful. Some really fantastic drawings and images you managed to find, Dominic. I had a couple of comments. One was, Dominic, very early on, you showed a beautiful photograph, probably your own, from the south side of the river, looking onto Churchill Estate Gardens, big blue sky, trees, the buildings orientated north-south. And I actually took some of my students there yesterday, and we were looking at that and how, because of that orientation, you have north-south, you have light coming in mornings and afternoons, which is great. And then you look to the south side of the river, and what we see is a great big blank of buildings which no longer go, which, well, weren't there some time ago, and they are orientated along the frontage of the river, very kind of grandly and selfishly spreading across the front of the river. So the view we get from the north side is of a development, and the view from the south side is of, the blocks, the beautiful spaces, and the great big trees. So I was just wondering, does anybody here know, is this part of planning policy, or is it just developers' ego and bravado that they have to take up as much of the river frontage with their development? Any thought, anybody?
There are 2 messages coming in. Susanna Charlton, are you there? Would you like to? Oh no, I think that's responding to. Anybody got an answer for Karen?
Maybe I'll just leave it there what people think about that, but it's a point to be made. I mean, look at the beauty of looking north to Churchill, and then we see when we look south. But Dominic, I did have a specific question about Churchill that you might be able to answer. I noticed that a number of the ground level flats have managed to acquire back gardens by chain link fencing being put up on the edge of some of the garden squares. Presumably that's a later day situation, but happened before the site was registered. Do you know anything about it?
As far as I can tell, and we didn't have time to look in the detail at the drawings, actually the ground floor, a lot of the ground floor flats were actually designed to have their own gardens. So yes, the fencing isn't always very pretty, but in the context of the wide spaces between each block, the little back gardens, I actually think add something. They've got personality, and whether they're chain link or whatever, but quite a lot of them are actually rather nicely gardened by individuals, and I think it adds something to the personality of the estate.
I don't disagree with that at all. And on the flats facing the river, they've got little gardens, but because it's not part of a big, because it's not facing at the edge of a square, they're less obvious. My main issue with them is the chain link fence. It's horrible. It's tall chain link fence. I can't believe that was an original material put in there.
No, it's not original, but what I'm saying is that the ground floor flats of the big blocks did actually have their own gardens.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, okay. I mean, curiously, we after we visited that site, we went across the road to Lillington Gardens, which was also nominated to compile in the record, and which was assessed but didn't get added to the register. And we noticed there, I mean, it's a very different site. It's much more intimate, smaller spaces, but we noticed that the ground floor flats do have walls enclosures for their gardens, and it was very, very effective. And as we walked around that site yesterday, we were just gobsmacked that it hadn't been added to the register, and really sad that it hadn't, because it's a wonderful, wonderful site, and I'd love for it to be revisited at some point. Thank you.
Well, I mean, in response to that, I mean, it's great that we were able to add 24 sites, 20th century sites to the register. But as you well know, Karen, as one of the original researchers, our shortlist started at 100. And I figured, as one of the people who helped get the initiative going, that we could just about cope with looking at 100 sites, because then when we whittled that down, each of those sites had to be further researched by volunteers. And that is where Jennifer's excellent point about enriching the list comes into play, because English Heritage simply do not have the resources to do that research. Hence the Gardens Trust stepping in and saying, look, we'll take on part of that responsibility. And I absolutely agree that and I'm sure that Susanna Charlton will also agree, that 24 is the start, but there's still quite a lot of work to do. And anybody listening who's keen researcher who wants to enrich the list, please get in touch, or just do it.
And I think we're acutely aware that in the list that we whittled down, because 24 was just a practical number that could be handled, you know, there are landscape types that are missing. So Karen knows this. I mean, I was amazed that a crematorium didn't come forward. So certainly there's lots to discuss there and lots more to explore.
With regard to enriching, who should they contact? You, Jennifer?
You can do it yourself. That's the whole point. It's open to everybody. If you just Google it, it'll explain what you do. You set up what they call a heritage passport. But you know, they're welcoming contributions. It'll help you. The web page explains what to do. Photographs are great because they're, you know, a record of that point in time. But you know, if you know of other interesting information, even just where the archive is, you know, that's a really valuable link to add. And it just says, yes, you know, there are plans that you should be going and looking at.
Thank you, Jennifer. Talking of links, thank you to Camilla and Anna Maisie for a couple of playground links, and I do feel a whole series on playgrounds is possibly required. Annabelle?
As long as we can go and play.
Pardon?
As long as we can go and play.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I would have thought that was fundamentally required. Annabelle, would you like to come back? And I'm afraid I interrupted you at one point. Have you further contributions to the debate?
No, I've got a little question for Dominic though, and I wondered, I don't know how you pronounce Oud, or spell Oud rather, why he's not known, or am I just being very ignorant? He's not as well known as Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe.
No,
or...
it was a rather nice discovery to see that he is extremely well respected in the architectural history world. I had never heard of him. So when I was just checking out the Keyfook estate, his name came up. So I used the wonderful Wikipedia to find out who he was and what was his contribution. And as I say, he was also a member of Der Stil, along with Mondrian and others. So they're, you know, they're very, very much sort of thinking in terms of the time, modernist thinking. And he spent 5 years as the city architect in Rotterdam. So no, you're not ignorant. Well, unless I'm ignorant as well. It's just, you know, it's one of those things that when you're chasing down something to find out, you know, I could have passed by Philip Powell's trip to the continent, but I just thought, you know, what was it that he saw, and why was he excited by it?
Okay, thank you. How do you spell Oud?
OUD.
Oh, right. Okay, lovely.
Not like the Doctor Who Ouds.
Okay.
Or was in the instrument. Thanks, Annabelle. That was much appreciated. Interesting comment from Camilla, which has just disappeared off my screen. But Camilla says, are you happy for me to read it, Camilla? That LCC flats in the 1950s were often orientated to have south and west facing sun balconies, which is something I certainly didn't realise. Dominic and Jennifer, have you got any other messages for us or comments that you would like to make before we close?
I'd just like to advertise one of your further forthcoming talks.
Oh, please feel free.
By me, which is about the water gardens at Burwood Place off Edgware Road, which is on the 22nd of February. And I will be talking about its designer, Philip Hicks, landscape architect, another person who nobody knows anybody about, but I found out quite a lot. And it will also have the sort of contentious issues that Jennifer and I have been talking about.
Thank you, Dominic. We look forward to that. Jennifer?
No, nothing from me, but I think, do look at all the insights and just think about, the trajectory of those landscapes, what's happening in them, what the pressures are, why they're changing, and, what is the conservation approach with them, what we benefit from. These are very valuable landscapes and they're only just maturing, and we really should look after them.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Could I just say one?
Yes.
Could I say one more small thing? Well, smallish. That as a result of the research that I did with Churchill Gardens, and I was actually commissioned by the housing corporation that run it, that I made a series of recommendations on management. First of all, recognition of the material, the paving materials, and so on, and future management. However, that was from one very enthusiastic individual who I believe has moved on. And I think the issue of replacing paving would come down to a site manager saying, well, all those old 2x3 slabs are broken, so we need to put in some new little concrete blocks. And I don't know if that would actually even get that issue to planning. It's whether the site managers actually understand and recognize what they're looking after.
I think that's such an important point. I think, the Alexandra Road, it was the residents who stopped, the slide happening. And at Brunel, it was the resident, or, the resident that Colin found, who, with maybe a couple of others, and also at Alexandra Park, who got together and said, oh, hang on a minute, these seats weren't red, pink and blue, or this paving is wrong, or there wasn't a wall here, or whatever. And I don't know how you find those people, or how you keep them, fired up to protect the site, because almost you need those people, don't you, on site, watching or aware all the time, and informed. I mean, obviously, and they were passionate enough and knew the site from very early on to be able to notice the change or to stop it or shout about it.
Annabelle, thank you. Yes, and I think this whole issue of not only a passion about a landscape, but understanding what makes that landscape so special, why so special, is a real challenge for many communities. And it's the old cartoon, isn't it, about 4 or 5 designs for people's back gardens, but what the client thinks they really want, and is probably exactly what they really want, is somewhere to hang the washing. Where do you come to between the over-designed at one end and please give us somewhere where we can put the washing out at the other. Annabelle, can I pass back to you, please? But actually, may I just say one thing? Thank you all for your comments, your compliments to our two speakers, very well deserved. But I will pass back to Annabelle to give you some serious appreciation.
Well, it was. I think we've barely tickled the surface actually with this discussion, and I think we've got to. Sorry, I lost my thing. We've got to do more. I think we've got to really expand on this, and maybe we have another one at the end of this series and go back and really review some of these points. And maybe if it's done in person, then it might be easier to sort of jump up and down and wave arms around and things. That was fantastic, Dominic. Thank you so much for shedding light on Churchill Gardens. I think this series has been wonderful in that, you know, each person has brought something very special, you know, told us all something or lots of special things about one particular site. And Jennifer, for your stand back and look at it all and where we are and where we need to go, and we'll definitely look up Matthew Saunders' review and read that. So I'm really grateful. I think I'd like to bring you both back, not just for the waterworks off Edgware Road, but at the end too, for something more and something different and something beefier, I think. Maybe a big round table, huge big round table. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dominic, for all the effort that you went to with all getting all that material, because that was fabulous. It's not often seen, so very much appreciated.